what we've known for a long time is that cells have a lifespan. Really, there is a finite number of times they can divide, and then they will just die. And this was a product of a research group led by an individual with the last name Hayflick. And what Hayflick showed was that cells can generally divide about 50 times, and then they're done. What was shown subsequent to that by the Blackburn group was that this is really regulated or controlled by the DNA. And the DNA has distinct regions called telomeres, which are on the ends of the chromosomes that are nonsense or non-coding regions. They're just kind of caps on the end. But when those telomeres become short with each subsequent replication event, and they do become shorter with each replication event, when they become so short that they're no longer existent, then the cell will go through apoptosis. So let's talk about that for just a minute. When we replicate our DNA, we have two complementary strands, and we'll talk about how that works after the next exam. But you have these little proteins that come along, and they read the DNA, and they lay out complementary strands to the DNA that we're reading. The problem is, because of how those proteins interact with the DNA molecule, they can't replicate the entire molecule. So it would look something like this. There is just one side of the DNA that has our A's, T's, G's, and C's all along its length like this. And what happens is a really large protein called DNA polymerase comes along and it binds right here to that start sequence. And then, and really this is the telomere region. This is the telomere. But because it's binding here, it can't replicate that. And so really it starts replication right here. And so it really only produces a complementary strand in here, and it's replicating in that direction. So this first little bit that it bounds to will never get replicated. But that's okay, because it's just nonsense DNA. It's just a telomere. So every time DNA is replicated, it becomes a little bit shorter. And after 50 replication events, it's so short that the cell just dies. It kills it off. But there are a series of tissues where you won't want that to happen, where you won't want DNA to become shorter with each replication event. And can you think of a tissue in which you wouldn't want DNA to become increasingly shorter?
Like your stomach?
Stomach? Maybe.
Or your brain?
Maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You think?
What did you call the...
This is this thing right here?
Yeah.
That circle thing, it's a protein called DNA polymerase that we'll talk about later. You don't need to know that right now.
Oh, okay.
Really what I want you to know from this diagram is the entirety of that DNA molecule isn't being replicated. That first little binding region gets missed. So when you're creating gametes, right, what you want to do is you want to give your offspring the full complement of DNA. But in order to make a gamete, you have to replicate your own DNA. Now, because of our cellular machinery, when we replicate it, it's always going to be a little bit shorter. But that's a bad thing, because that means that your children are going to end up with shorter telomeres than you have, and the lifespan of their cells ought to be shorter. As a consequence, and to counteract that effect, what we have is a protein called telomerase that's only active inside our gametic tissues that lengthens out those telomeres so that the chromosomes that are being produced in egg cells and sperm cells have the entire complement of DNA, and the telomeres are as long as we can make them. You know, it's hypothesized that senescence, that is, all the bad stuff that happens to us as we get old, is really a product of telomere shortening. That as we continue to replicate our DNA, telomeres get shorter and shorter and cells begin to die, right? And then we get saggy and old and our hair turns gray and stuff like that. The crazy thing is, if that's true, we have a protein that's active inside our bodies that would counteract that, right? Telomerase. So we have that genetic code in all of our somatic cells And what if we could activate it? Would you want us to do that and increase lifespan?
Be like a fountain of youth.
That's exactly what it would be like. Would you want to do that?
Would you be healthy though?
Mhm.
Yeah.
If senescence is a product of this, then yeah, you would be healthy. You would?
I would do it.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or would your cells not die then if you? No.
Did you guys read the Postmortal?
Yeah.
No.
Isn't that what
That's
this?
why it's a no.
Isn't
I was
that
thinking
what this is about?
No.
It is.
I mean, selfishly, I'd like to do it too because there's a ton of stuff that I would still like to do before I die. But
But there's a drawback too, because then you would live on and your family would die off and you would, like the postmodal, you know.
Unless you do that to your family too.
That's true.
Well, what if they don't want to? You can't force somebody to do something if they don't want to, so
You just
then
wanna
that
die?
would suck.
Yeah, I just wanna die.
I felt the same thing sometimes when I was sitting in biology classes.
Would your meat bag stay the same?
Yeah. If by meat bag you mean your body?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what me and my husband call it.
Okay, so another reason that
I've always wanted
having a
to live to
finite
112.
lifespan for a cell is important is because it's a positive way for us to control cancer. So let's talk a little bit about cancer. And the purpose of this discussion is supposed to be a segue, right? So one of the reasons that these telomeres are really important is because it counteracts the effects of cancer. It's an anti-cancer sort of mechanism that we have inside our bodies. Now, whether or not that's truly the reason that it evolved, I think is debatable, but it certainly has that positive benefit. So, what is cancer? Cancer is just uncontrolled cell growth. When the cell cycle goes awry and cells begin dividing outside our control, that's cancer. Now, cancer produces a tumor. In fact, tumors are, by definition, cancerous. They're just cellular growths that we don't control. Now, there are varieties of tumors, right? There are benign tumors. And benign tumors, if you're going to go for cancer, you're going to want to go for a benign cancer, right? Because those don't spread throughout the body. Those stay localized, generally embedded inside healthy tissues. And then there are the bad types of cancer. There are malignant cancers. And those are the kinds that fracture and can spread throughout the body. That process of a tumor fracturing and spreading throughout the body is called metastasis, or the tumor metastasizes. Now, what's insidious about this is that tumor uses our body's own circulatory system to spread those cancerous cells. It will either get into your veins and your arteries, or it can get into your lymphatic system, and it can just be transported all over. There are a number of cells that, or excuse me, a number of types of cancer that are prone to metastasis. Breast cancer is a big one. Pancreatic cancer metastasizes with some frequency. Lung cancer metastasizes with some frequency. There are others that remain localized, like prostate cancer for guys.
What about brain cancer?
Brain cancer stays mostly localized because of the blood-brain barrier. For sure. But it's not
Colon?
good. Colon cancer, I don't know how frequently that one metastasizes. Yeah.
I have two questions. So, is cancer genetic? So,
Wonderful question. Do you want me to answer that one?
yeah, answer that.
So yes, there are genetic propensities to some types of cancer, right?
Right.
So like breast cancer, there is a positive correlation between the probability of having breast cancer and whether or not your maternal line has had breast cancer.
Okay. So, what about, does that also include like the cancers that we can cause from smoking or just chewing?
Right. So there are also environmental components as well. Skin cancer is another really good example of that. If you're outside too much and you don't wear sunscreen, then you can get skin cancer. And so it's this weird combination between genetic propensities and the kinds of things that we do, our activities.
Okay.
just by show of hands, who has an immediate family member that's contended with cancer? And how? Sure. And we'll include extended family as well, so grandparents, aunts, uncles. Yeah, it's crazy, right? So it's estimated that 50% of us, that 50% of us that are born in the U.S. will contend with cancer at some point. It's the flip of a coin, right? So there are 24 of us in this class, which means that at some point, 12 of us are going to contend with cancer.
Thanks.
My wife, her mother had breast cancer. Her uncle died of pancreatic cancer. Her grandmother died of breast cancer. So the probability that my wife is going to have at some point breast cancer in her life is incredibly high. And we have 4 daughters. And so the probability that each one of those 4 girls is going to contend with breast cancer is also incredibly high. The question is this: you can be screened to see whether or not you carry the gene that makes you likely to develop breast cancer. Would you want to know?
No.
I did.
Did?
I did the BRCA testing because my mom had breast cancer.
And do you mind sharing how it came back?
I don't have the gene. But my daughter, they're going to test her. They can't test her until she's 21. So I'm hoping that she does not have the gene.
Yeah.
They can't stop it though. Can't.
No, it's just a screening to know whether or not you carry the gene that makes you likely to have it.
So you can prepare yourself.
Yeah, prepare and like, you can keep checking, because if you have it, you'd be like, all right, I need to keep checking.
Yeah.
But at the
Well,
same
then-
time,
So-
that would like take over your life because you'd always be worrying about, do I have it?
But
Yep.
still, like, I
But
feel
then
like,
you can check more frequently, like you were saying.
yeah, I feel like you can always check. It's better to like know if you're gonna die in the future.
So what that means is, right, if you know that you carry that gene and there's a history of it, then what you can do is get checked. You can have mammograms earlier in life, right? And that's really the key to cancer survival. It's early diagnosis. Yeah.
Is that
Sophia?
just for cancer? Can you screen for like anything?
Oh, you can screen for all sorts of things. We'll talk about that when we talk about genetics. Yeah, you can screen for all sorts of things these days. And in fact, you can design, potentially, children to have or not have specific characteristics. Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, so another interesting thing about cancer is that there are environmental triggers, but there are also viral triggers, right? So there was viral. So do you remember a few years ago there was like this big push to have all young women immunized with the HPV, human papilloma virus? That's because exposure to HPV, human papilloma virus, has a positive correlation with cervical cancer. And so there was this big push to have all girls immunized against that. In fact, some states made it mandatory. How do you feel about that?
I think that's smart.
You think it's smart?
I think it's a good thing.
What's that?
I think it's a good thing.
I think as a parent, I would make the decision in discussion with my daughters
Yeah.
to have them vaccinated. My problem is I don't necessarily want state or federal governments saying this is what you have to do.
True.
You know what I mean? So, lung cancers are a really good example of environmental factors that can be triggers. Skin cancer is another really good one. Rectal colon cancer is a product generally of diet. So rectal colon cancer is really common among individuals that eat lots and lots of meat and very few fibrous foods. So we didn't really talk a lot about fiber when we talked about biological molecules, but there are 2 types of fiber. So there are soluble and insoluble fibers. Insoluble fibers work basically like a loofah inside your GI tract. You guys know what polyps are? Yeah, so eventually you're all going to have to take a trip to the doctor and visit Dr. Jellyfinger, and he's going to check whether or not you have polyps, which are just little growths inside your colon and intestinal tract. And they're just little precancerous growths. What insoluble fibers do is they just kind of move through your GI tract. You can't digest them, so they just kind of scrape the inside of your GI tract, which is, it sounds terrible, but it's actually a really good thing. It scrapes off those polyps, and it also stimulates the production of a mucosal lining that lubes things up a little bit. And then there are insoluble fibers, and insoluble fibers basically become like a growth medium for bacteria. All those really important bacteria inside your body that help you digest things and make less nutritious foods more nutritious grow inside those insoluble fibers. So, or excuse me, inside those soluble fibers. So individuals with a really high meat content in their diet lack that fiber and aren't scraping off those polyps and aren't encouraging the growth of really important like internal gut flora. And then there are some cancers that we just don't really understand very well. Breast cancer is a really good example of that. We know that there is a genetic component to it, but there are some individuals that carry that gene that never develop breast cancer, and there are others that don't carry the gene that will still develop breast cancer. So there's just this really weird interaction between environment and genetic architecture that dictates the development of breast cancer.
What in the environment would
So,
trigger that, like radiation?
High exposure to different types of carcinogens, including like tobaccos. Individuals that have that gene, I believe, and smoke have a much higher occurrence of breast cancer than individuals that have that gene that don't smoke. There are also other chemical cues that you can get from like highly processed foods. Yeah.
One of my friends has multiple myeloma, which causes the TMA2, and so it's diagnosed 70 or older, but she's like
Okay.
what would cause that? Like, is it plasma?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. So there is also treatment, right? And so for treatment, there are generally 3 options. And you know what those options are?
Radiation, chemo.
There's surgery, radiation, and chemo, right? And chemo and radiation are often confused. So surgery is pretty obvious. If there's a large tumor and they can remove it, they will. The scary thing with that is you need to make sure that you get all of the tumor. If you leave some of that tumor behind, then it can just regrow.